Murder at the Fashion Show Runway, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, dear listeners, to another evening of mystery and intrigue. I'm Connor, your guide through the twisted corridors of crime and deception that wind through our seemingly peaceful villages and elegant city venues alike. Tonight, we delve into a case that shook the fashion world to its very foundations, a tale of glamour hiding terrible secrets, of charity events concealing darker realities. Our investigator, as always, is that remarkable woman of keen observation and sharper intuition, Miss Jane Marple. So settle in with your favourite beverage, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a mystery where the glittering world of haute couture becomes the backdrop for something far more sinister. This is the story of Murder at the Fashion Show Runway. Chapter 1. Silken Threads and Hidden Secrets. The ballroom of the Ashworth Hotel had been transformed into something resembling a temple to modern fashion, with its soaring ceilings draped in swathes of imported silk and carefully positioned lighting that cast everything in shades of gold and rose. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the third row of folding chairs, adjusted her glasses and observed the proceedings with the particular attention she habitually applied to any gathering where human nature was on full display. The annual charity fashion show for the St. Mary Mead Children's Hospital had become something of a tradition in recent years, though Miss Marple reflected that the event seemed to grow more elaborate with each passing season, straying further from its original purpose of raising funds for a genuinely worthy cause. The show's centerpiece was a collection by the renowned designer Marcus Ashby, whose dramatic creations had graced the catwalks of Paris, Milan, and New York. At 52 years of age, Ashby had achieved the rare combination of critical acclaim and considerable commercial success, his designs worn by celebrities and royalty alike. Yet something about the man troubled Miss Marple, though she could not immediately identify precisely what it might be. Perhaps it was the arrogance evident in his bearing as he moved behind the velvet curtains that separated the backstage area from public view, or perhaps it was something more subtle, a discordant note in the symphony of his carefully cultivated public persona. Miss Marple had arrived at the hotel that afternoon as the guest of Mrs. Patricia Summers, a woman of considerable wealth whose charitable donations had made her something of a fixture in local society. Patricia had been delighted when Miss Marple agreed to attend, and had provided her with a detailed briefing on the various personalities involved in organising the evening. The backstage area, Patricia had explained, would be a scene of controlled chaos, with models, assistants, and various hangers-on, all contributing to the organised frenzy that characterised such professional events. As the Yanti first models glided onto the runway in Ashby's opening ensemble, Miss Marple found herself studying not the clothes themselves, but the people behind the scenes. Through a gap in the backstage curtains, she could observe the organised activity that created the illusion of effortless elegance. Assistants adjusted garments, makeup artists touched up faces, and models moved with the precision of dancers, following a meticulously choreographed routine. But it was Marcus Ashby himself who most engaged her attention. He moved among his team with an imperious air, occasionally pausing to make adjustments to a collar or hem, his gestures sharp with a kind of irritability that seemed entirely disproportionate to the minor nature of his corrections. During the interval between the first and second segments of the show, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way toward the restroom, though her actual intention was to observe more closely the backstage operations. The hotel's management had cordoned off the area to unauthorized personnel, but Miss Marple's air of gentle authority and the visible program in her hand seemed to grant her an implicit permission to circulate. She found herself passing through a corridor lined with garment racks, each carefully labelled and organised, when a raised voice caught her attention. The voice was unmistakably that of Marcus Ashby, and it carried the sharp edge of barely contained anger. "You're completely incompetent," he was saying to someone out of her view. "I specifically requested that my personal clothing be handled with particular care. Every single garment that touches my skin must meet exacting standards. I won't have my work compromised by carelessness." A younger voice, trembling slightly with what might have been fear or anger, responded with obvious difficulty. "I followed the procedure exactly as you specified, Mr. Ashby. The laundry service you use returned everything according to your requirements. Everything was handled properly." Ashby's response was cut short as Miss Marple continued down the corridor, not wishing to be discovered eavesdropping. Yet the brief exchange had provided her with useful information. The designer, it appeared, was subject to some form of allergy or sensitivity that required special precautions regarding his clothing. This was not uncommon, of course, but the vehemence of his reaction suggested something more serious than a simple preference for hypoallergenic fabrics. Returning to her seat, Miss Marple observed the second segment of the show with renewed interest. Marcus Ashby took his final bow to thunderous applause, the audience clearly enchanted by the elegance and innovation of his designs. He wore an expression of satisfaction that seemed to Miss Marple entirely too theatrical, as though he were performing the role of the pleased and confident designer, rather than genuinely experiencing such emotions. The evening concluded with the customary reception, where attendees could examine the pieces more closely and Ashby himself could be photographed with various wealthy patrons and society figures. It was during this reception that Miss Marple observed an exchange that would later prove far more significant than she initially realized. A man of approximately 40 years, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, had approached Marcus Ashby with what appeared to be a request for a private conversation. The designer's reaction was immediate and visceral. He turned away from the man with a gesture of obvious dismissal, his face darkening with what looked like anger or perhaps fear. The man persisted briefly, but recognizing that his overture was unwelcome, he withdrew into the crowd. As the evening drew toward a close and guests began to depart, Patricia Summers approached Miss Marple with evident satisfaction. "Well, Jane, what did you think of the collection? Quite remarkable, isn't it? I must confess, Marcus has outdone himself this year." Miss Marple removed her glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully, a habit she employed when considering how best to phrase delicate observations. "The designs are certainly impressive from a technical standpoint," she replied carefully, "though I found myself wondering about the designer himself. Is Mr. Ashby always quite so temperamental with his staff?" Patricia laughed lightly, the sound lacking genuine humour. "Oh, that's simply Marcus being Marcus. He's always been something of a perfectionist, though I'll admit his behaviour has become rather more volatile in recent months. Apparently, he's been dealing with some business difficulties, though he rarely discusses such matters. Some of his factories overseas have been the subject of labour disputes, I believe. Nothing that affects his reputation here, of course, but I suppose such matters do create stress." As Miss Marple bid farewell to her hostess and made her way home through the evening streets, she found her mind dwelling on the evening's small mysteries. The designer's obvious anxiety regarding something besides his professional performance, the exchange with the weathered stranger, the vehement reaction to what appeared to be a simple laundry matter. Individually, such details might mean nothing, but collectively they suggested a man labouring under considerable strain. Chapter 2. The Morning After Tragedy. The telephone call came shortly after 9 o'clock the following morning, summoning Miss Marple to the Ashworth Hotel with an urgency that transcended normal police procedure. The voice of Inspector Dermot Craddock, whom she had assisted on previous occasions, carried a note of barely suppressed tension. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might find it convenient to come to the hotel immediately. We have a situation here that I believe might benefit from your particular perspective. A man has died, apparently of natural causes, though certain circumstances surrounding his death have proven troubling." Miss Marple, who had been engaged in her usual morning correspondence, set down her pen and reached for her coat without hesitation. The death of a man in good health at an event she had attended the previous evening seemed unlikely to be purely coincidental. Within the hour, she found herself in the hotel's backstage area, now cordoned off and transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation, rather than the site of glamorous theatrical production. Marcus Ashby's body had been discovered that morning by one of his assistants, lying in what the hotel staff had designated as the designer's private dressing room. He had arrived early to prepare for a morning interview with a fashion journalist, and had been found collapsed on the floor near his makeup table, an empty EpiPen beside him. Emergency services had been called immediately, but Ashby was already beyond assistance, having suffered what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction of catastrophic proportions. Inspector Craddock led Miss Marple through the scene with the careful deference he had learned to employ during their previous collaborations. The dressing room was appointed with considerable luxury, featuring a large mirror surrounded by professional lighting, a comfortable sofa, and what appeared to be a well-stocked bar. A faint smell hung in the air, something chemical and distinctly artificial, the unmistakable scent of commercial laundry products. The designer's clothing lay in carefully organized piles on a mahogany chair, the items having been removed during the initial investigation. His personal effects, including his wallet, watch, and several prescription bottles, had been catalogued and arranged on the vanity table. But it was the EpiPen that commanded primary attention, lying as it did on the floor near the body, its plunger fully depressed and apparently empty. "Here's what troubles me, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock explained, gesturing toward the medical device. Ashby suffered from a severe peanut allergy, a fact that was apparently well known to everyone in his immediate circle. He carried an EpiPen at all times, kept backups in various locations, and was generally quite vigilant about his condition. Yet when he attempted to use the EpiPen after experiencing his allergic reaction, it appears to have contained saline rather than epinephrine. The substance is still being analysed, but preliminary tests suggest exactly that. Miss Marple examined the EpiPen without touching it, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Someone has deliberately substituted the medication with saline. This suggests premeditation, planning, a deliberate intention to cause harm. Has Mr. Ashby consumed anything since arriving at the hotel this morning? Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. The assistant who discovered him said Ashby appeared to have been preparing for the day, arranging his clothing and reviewing his appearance in the mirror. There's a coffee cup on the vanity, which we're currently analysing, but preliminary inspection suggests it contained coffee obtained from the hotel's regular breakfast service, which all staff have access to. However, there's something more puzzling still. What might that be? Miss Marple inquired, settling herself into one of the dressing-room chairs. The allergic reaction itself, Craddock explained. The visible symptoms, the severity of the response, suggest exposure to something far beyond what would typically be found in a simple cup of coffee. His breathing had been compromised, his throat appeared inflamed, and the emergency responders noted that his skin bore signs of severe contact dermatitis. Whatever he was exposed to would have had to be highly concentrated and potentially administered through multiple vectors. Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached the piles of clothing, examining them with careful attention. The garments were all of Ashby's personal collection, not part of the show's official merchandise. They appeared to be high-quality items, impeccably made, though she noted that several bore labels indicating special hypoallergenic processing. "Do we know when these clothes were last laundered?" she asked. Inspector Craddock checked his notes. According to Ashby's assistant, these items were cleaned and returned just yesterday afternoon, delivered to the hotel specifically for his use this morning. Ashby was apparently particular about his clothing, requiring that everything be handled according to very specific protocols. "This suggests that the clothing itself may be the vector," Miss Marple said slowly, examining one of Ashby's shirts more closely. "I perceive the distinct odour of commercial fabric softener, something quite pronounced and unmistakable." "Tell me, Inspector, would such a substance typically cause an allergic reaction of the magnitude you've described?" Craddock shook his head slowly. "Not in a person without extreme sensitivity, though certainly peanut-allergic individuals sometimes have broader sensitivities to various chemical compounds. The medical examiner is currently reviewing the case, but the general consensus seems to be that Ashby had some form of chemical allergy, in addition to his known peanut allergy. However, the concentration of fabric softener residue on his clothing appears to be far above normal levels." As Miss Marple continued her examination of the dressing room, she observed various details that suggested a man living under considerable strain. Empty sleeping pill bottles in the trash, newspaper clippings regarding labour disputes in Southeast Asian factories, and several letters bearing official government seals and return addresses, suggesting regulatory agencies. The surface picture was one of success and accomplishment, yet beneath lay evidence of significant stress and concern. Is there someone I might speak with regarding Mr. Ashby's staff and associates? Miss Marple asked. Someone who could provide insight into his recent state of mind and his professional relationships? Craddock led her to a small adjoining room where several individuals had been gathered for questioning. Among them was a young woman of perhaps 25 years, introduced as Claire Dubois, Ashby's head assistant. The woman appeared visibly shaken, her usual professional composure clearly disrupted by the morning's tragic events. Also present was a middle-aged man identified as Richard Kellerman, the hotel's event coordinator, and several members of the hotel staff who had been involved in the show's organisation. It was Claire who provided Miss Marple with the most useful information. In response to gentle questioning, she revealed that Ashby had become increasingly preoccupied in recent months, often distracted and sometimes quite irritable. He had received several telephone calls that appeared to deeply disturb him and had made what seemed to be an unusual number of references to his medical conditions and his need for specialized handling of his personal items. There was also a man, Claire said hesitantly, who came backstage several times asking to speak with Mr. Ashby. Mr. Ashby wouldn't see him and instructed me to deny him access to the backstage area. The man seemed quite persistent and appeared genuinely upset by Mr. Ashby's refusal to speak with him. I never learned his name, but he had the appearance of someone accustomed to outdoor work, calloused hands, that sort of thing. This description matched precisely the man Miss Marple had observed the previous evening, the individual whose approach had been so abruptly rejected by the designer. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the ultimate significance of these details remained obscured. Chapter 3. Labour Disputes and Hidden Identities. As the morning progressed, Inspector Craddock received a telephone call that appeared to significantly alter the trajectory of the investigation. The caller identified himself as Dr. James Patterson, who described himself as a federal labour investigator currently engaged in examining alleged violations at several facilities owned or operated by Marcus Ashby. Patterson indicated that he possessed information he believed to be relevant to the circumstances of Ashby's death, and requested an immediate meeting with the investigating officer. The subsequent meeting took place in one of the hotel's private conference rooms, with Miss Marple present at Craddock's invitation. Dr. Patterson proved to be a man of approximately 60 years, his weathered face bearing the marks of someone who had spent considerable time in difficult circumstances. His manner was thoughtful and measured, but his eyes carried the weight of knowledge that appeared to cause him considerable distress. "I must begin by explaining the nature of my investigation," Patterson said, his voice carrying a note of reluctance that suggested this confession had come at considerable personal cost. For the past 18 months, I have been examining allegations of labour violations at manufacturing facilities in Vietnam and Cambodia that are owned or operated by Marcus Ashby's holding company. The allegations include inadequate safety conditions, wage theft, and more troublingly, the exploitation of trafficking victims who were essentially held in conditions of forced labour. Inspector Craddock's expression had grown increasingly grim as Patterson described the situation. "Are you telling me that Ashby knowingly operated sweatshops utilising trafficked workers?" Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's more complex than that, I'm afraid. My evidence suggests that Ashby may not have been directly aware of the most egregious violations, as he maintained significant distance from the day-to-day operations of these facilities. However, he was aware that his production costs were being maintained at unrealistically low levels, which should have raised questions about the means by which such economics were being achieved. Moreover, when I first approached him regarding these allegations, he took steps to obstruct my investigation." "What sort of steps?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Patterson's jaw tightened visibly before he continued. "He offered me a substantial sum of money to allow the investigation to proceed without further scrutiny from my office. In essence, he attempted to bribe a federal investigator to overlook evidence of serious criminal violations. I refused, of course, and I reported the matter through proper channels. However, the damage to my professional credibility had already begun." Miss Marple observed him closely. "Your professional credibility was somehow compromised as a result of Mr. Ashby's attempted bribe?" Patterson nodded miserably. "Ashby has considerable resources and significant connections within certain circles. After I refused his offer, He initiated a smear campaign against me, suggesting that I was motivated by personal animosity and professional jealousy. He suggested that I was engaged in extortion, using my investigative authority to extract money from innocent businessmen. These suggestions found their way to my superiors, and my investigation was effectively suspended pending an inquiry into my own conduct. The irony appeared to be cutting deeply into Patterson's sense of justice. The investigation into his integrity took on such significance that the investigation into Ashby's actual crimes effectively stalled. Meanwhile, the conditions in his factories continued, and at least 2 workers died from inadequate safety measures that could have been prevented with minimal investment in improvements. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with evident interest. "Dr. Patterson, I assume you were the individual who attempted to approach Mr. Ashby at last evening's fashion show?" Patterson's expression suggested that this question had struck him unexpectedly. "Yes, I was hoping to convince him to allow me to reinitiate the investigation. I thought that if I could speak to him directly, if I could make him understand the human cost of his business practices, perhaps he might cooperate." My approach was naive, I realize now. Mr. Ashby was not interested in understanding the human implications of his choices. As Patterson spoke, Miss Marple found herself considering the broader implications of his revelation. A man whose crimes had been effectively concealed through his use of wealth and influence to discredit his accuser. A system that had somehow allowed such reversal of roles, where the investigator became the subject of investigation while the criminal remained protected. Yet she also observed something else in Patterson's bearing, a particular quality of distress that suggested knowledge he had not yet revealed. "Dr. Patterson," she said carefully, "there is something else troubling you, I suspect. Something beyond the simple frustration of being unable to pursue your investigation. Would you be willing to share the nature of that concern?" Patterson was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping before him. Finally, he drew a long breath and met Miss Marple's gaze directly. "I came here this morning with the intention of confronting Marcus Ashby one final time. I had obtained new evidence that would have reopened the investigation into his factory operations, evidence that could not be easily discredited. I was prepared to present this evidence to him and to give him an ultimatum. Either he would cooperate fully with my investigation, or I would ensure that my allegations became public knowledge. Consequences to my career be damned." "And did you succeed in presenting this ultimatum?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I never reached him," Patterson said heavily. "I arrived at the hotel at approximately 7:30 this morning, hoping to catch him before his schedule became too crowded. I was turned away by security before I could reach the backstage area. By the time I'd convinced the hotel staff that I had legitimate reasons to be here, Mr. Ashby had already been found dead." Inspector Craddock set down his pen and fixed Patterson with an appraising stare. "Dr. Patterson, I must ask you this directly. Did you have any involvement in Mr. Ashby's death?" The question appeared to shake Patterson profoundly. He seemed to age several years in the moment it took him to respond. "No, Inspector, I did not. Whatever my feelings toward Marcus Ashby, I did not kill him. However, I must confess that my first reaction upon learning of his death was not grief or shock, but a sense of profound and shameful relief. A man I'd come to regard as an obstacle to justice had been removed by forces beyond my control, and my immediate response was gratitude rather than sorrow. That said something troubling about my own character, I fear. As the interview concluded, Miss Marple found herself possessed of several crucial pieces of information that, while individually significant, did not yet coalesce into a clear picture. A designer with a severe allergy, subjected to unusual pressure, and apparently burdened by guilt regarding his business practices. A labour investigator with the motive and the knowledge to understand how to manipulate medical devices. An employee who had been close enough to Ashby to potentially access his personal effects. And somewhere in this tangle of relationships and motivations lay the answer to the question of who had substituted Ashby's life-saving medication with saline. Chapter 4. The Laundry Service Inquiry. The laundry service that had processed Marcus Ashby's clothing proved to be a family-operated business called Ashworth Linens, located on the opposite side of the city from the hotel. Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple visited the establishment the following afternoon, arriving during what appeared to be a particularly hectic portion of the day's operations. The facility was substantially larger than Miss Marple had anticipated, with several industrial-sized washing machines, pressing equipment, and an impressive array of organized storage spaces. The proprietor, a man named Henry Ashworth, appeared visibly unsettled by the police investigation's focus on his business. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, with the bearing of someone who took considerable pride in his professional reputation. The accusation that his laundry service might have played a role in a customer's death appeared to wound him deeply. "I can assure you," he said emphatically, "that our handling of Mr. Ashby's personal items was exemplary. He was one of our most valued clients, precisely because of how seriously we took his special requirements. All of his clothing was processed according to his explicit specifications. No commercial fabric softener was ever used on any of his items." Inspector Craddock consulted his notes. "Yet my forensic examination indicates that Mr. Ashby's clothing bore traces of commercial fabric softener, and in concentrations far exceeding what would normally be present on garments. How would you account for this discrepancy?" Henry Ashworth's expression became increasingly troubled as the inspector spoke. "This is extraordinarily distressing. My records show that Mr. Ashby's items were washed with our hypoallergenic detergent, processed through our specialized rinsing system, and dried without any fabric softener or chemical additives whatsoever. The items were then carefully folded and placed in sealed plastic bags for transport to the hotel to prevent any contamination during delivery. However," Miss Marple observed, "you're suggesting that the contamination occurred after the items left your facility?" "That would appear to be the case," Ashworth replied. "I can only assume that someone tampered with the clothing between its delivery to the hotel and Mr. Ashby's use of it. Alternatively, the contamination occurred at some point in Mr. Ashby's personal handling of the items, though that seems less likely given the concentration you mentioned." Miss Marple requested to examine the records documenting Ashby's service history, and Ashworth complied readily, producing a detailed file that showed a consistent pattern of specialized handling extending back several years. The specifications were indeed quite exacting, with detailed instructions regarding the absence of any commercial chemical additives, the use of specifically approved detergents, and special handling procedures designed to minimize the risk of allergic reactions. "There is something I should mention," Ashworth said hesitantly, as they were reviewing the documents. "About 3 weeks ago, Mr. Ashby came to our facility personally. This was unusual, as typically his assistant handled all communication regarding his service. He was quite agitated, which was also unusual. He instructed me that I was to maintain meticulous records of his account, and that any deviation from his specifications was to be reported to him immediately. He also requested that I maintain a log of everyone who had access to his items during processing." "Did anyone have access to his items during processing?" Inspector Craddock asked with evident interest. Ashworth hesitated, clearly struggling with the implications of what he was about to reveal. "One of my employees, a man named David Carver, had requested a transfer to handle Mr. Ashby's account specifically. Carver had expressed interest in doing more careful, detailed work, and I believed it was an opportunity for professional growth. However, after Mr. Ashby's personal visit and his increasingly stringent specifications, I became concerned about Carver's reliability. I'm ashamed to admit that I had him follow Mr. Ashby's items during the final few days before the fashion show to ensure that Carver was adhering to all specified procedures." "And was he adhering to the procedures?" Miss Marple inquired. Ashworth's discomfort was evident. "No, he was not. During the final processing before delivery to the hotel, Carver appeared to deliberately deviate from the specified protocol. He used our standard detergent, he applied fabric softener despite explicit instructions not to do so, and he processed the items through our regular drying cycle rather than the specialized procedure Mr. Ashby had requested. When I confronted him about this, he became defensive and eventually resigned from his position. This occurred 3 days before the fashion show. Inspector Craddock's interest had clearly been piqued. Do you have any idea why Carver would deliberately contaminate Mr. Ashby's clothing in such a manner?" "I'm afraid I don't," Ashworth replied. "However, I do know that Carver had some form of connection to Dr. James Patterson, the federal labor investigator, They were seen speaking together on at least 2 occasions, and Carver mentioned something vague about believing that Patterson was conducting important work regarding labour practices. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock exchanged a significant glance. The connection between Carver and Patterson was potentially highly relevant, though the exact nature of that connection remained obscure. As they conducted further interviews with the laundry service staff, a picture began to emerge of David Carver as a man troubled by something beyond simple professional competence. One staff member mentioned that Carver had spoken about personal guilt and his need to do something to correct past mistakes. Another indicated that Carver had been visibly distressed after what appeared to be a telephone conversation several weeks prior. The general impression was of a man struggling with significant personal and moral concerns. The investigation subsequently shifted to locating David Carver, but this proved to be more difficult than anticipated. Carver's home appeared to be abandoned, his residence containing only minimal possessions and no indication of his current location. His bank records showed no recent transactions, and his family indicated they had not heard from him in several months. The pattern suggested a man who had deliberately made himself difficult to locate, perhaps anticipating that he might become a subject of investigative interest. Chapter 5: The Document Trail and Corporate Secrets. As the investigation into Carver's activities deepened, Inspector Craddock received access to the contents of Marcus Ashby's office at his design studio, a space that had remained essentially undisturbed since the designer's death. The office was appointed with considerable elegance, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, original artwork on the walls, and a desk of mahogany that spoke of considerable investment in personal comfort and aesthetic appreciation. However, beneath this surface of refined elegance lay evidence of significant business and personal turmoil. Craddock and Miss Marple's examination of Ashby's filing systems revealed documentation of the various manufacturing facilities that comprised his business empire, along with correspondence suggesting that Ashby had been receiving reports regarding conditions in these facilities, reports that he had chosen to ignore or actively suppress. One particular folder, labelled Confidential Labour Matters, contained a series of communications that proved especially illuminating. These documents detailed allegations of wage theft, safety violations, and the exploitation of workers, all of which had been communicated to Ashby through various channels. Alongside these allegation documents were responses from Ashby's legal representatives, all of which employed similar tactics for deflecting responsibility or rendering the allegations legally meaningless through technical loopholes and regulatory ambiguities. However, it was a series of handwritten notes in Ashby's own script that proved most revealing of the designer's internal state. These notes, apparently never intended for anyone else's eyes, contained expressions of guilt, anger, and what appeared to be genuine distress regarding the human cost of his business practices. Yet alongside these expressions of conscience lay calculations regarding profit margins, cost savings achieved through the exploitation of labour, and cost-benefit analyses that weighed the potential legal liability of continued operations against the financial benefits of maintaining the status quo. Miss Marple observed these documents with the careful attention she habitually applied to any revelation of human complexity. Here was clear evidence that Marcus Ashby had been fully aware of the nature of his business practices, despite his later claims of ignorance. The consciousness of guilt evident in his private notes suggested that his conscience, however effectively suppressed in his public interactions, had not been entirely absent. Among the documents was also evidence of Ashby's relationship with David Carver. A handwritten note in Claire Dubois' handwriting, apparently discovered among Ashby's personal papers, indicated that Carver had served as a liaison between Ashby and his manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia. Carver had been responsible for implementing efficiency measures that, while cost-effective, had necessarily involved conditions that Carver himself apparently recognized as ethically problematic. Inspector Craddock located a personal diary of Carver's in the storage area of Ashby's office, apparently abandoned there and overlooked during routine cleaning. The diary entries provided extensive insight into the man's psychological state during the period leading up to the fashion show. Carver had written extensively about his growing sense of guilt regarding his role in the implementation of labour practices he recognized as deeply wrong. He described his growing Awareness that these practices had resulted in the deaths of at least 2 workers due to inadequate safety measures, and his inability to live with the weight of his complicity. Several entries demonstrated Carver's gradual escalation from passive guilt to active consideration of intervention. He wrote about his conversations with Dr. Patterson and his growing conviction that something needed to be done to prevent the continuation of the exploitation and suffering that his own work had facilitated. Yet the diary also revealed Carver's confusion regarding the appropriate form such intervention should take, along with his awareness that direct action might place him in legal jeopardy. The final diary entry, dated 2 weeks before the fashion show, was particularly revealing. Carver had written, "I can no longer continue this pretense of normalcy. Dr. Patterson has provided me with documentation that proves beyond doubt the extent of what has occurred, and his investigation has been deliberately sabotaged through means that I now understand I helped facilitate. I have received communications indicating that Mr. Ashby does not intend to cooperate with any investigation, regardless of the evidence presented. If the only way to prevent the continuation of this exploitation is to ensure that Mr. Ashby's methods are exposed through his destruction, then perhaps that sacrifice is necessary. I have begun to consider the means by which such exposure might be achieved." Inspector Craddock set down the diary with evident frustration. This certainly suggests that Carver had the motive and the knowledge to attempt to kill Ashby. However, it does not provide definitive proof, and more importantly, we have yet to locate the man himself. Miss Marple, who had been reading excerpts of the diary over Craddock's shoulder, looked troubled. The diary reveals someone in significant psychological distress, capable of justifying extreme action through appeal to moral necessity. However, I would like to propose a different interpretation of the evidence. Observe that the final entry speaks of considering means, not of having implemented any particular plan. The shift from consideration to action is sometimes quite significant in such matters. Craddock studied her carefully, recognizing from their previous collaborations that her intuitions often proved valuable. "You're suggesting that someone else might have put Carver's general intention into specific practice?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "The substitution of Ashby's medication and the deliberate contamination of his clothing represent particular forms of knowledge and access. Carver possessed the knowledge regarding Ashby's allergic sensitivities and had access to information about his daily routines. However, the actual implementation of the poison appears to have required someone with intimate access to Ashby's immediate environment during the period before his death." Chapter 6. The Missing Hours and the Confession. The investigation subsequently shifted focus to the hours immediately preceding Ashby's death, and specifically to the movements of those individuals who had direct access to his dressing room and personal effects. Inspector Craddock arranged for detailed interviews with every member of the hotel staff, the event organization team, and Ashby's own associates who had been present at the hotel during the relevant time period. It was during these interviews that Claire Dubois' account began to reveal significant inconsistencies. When initially questioned, she had provided what appeared to be a straightforward narrative of her activities, claiming that she had spent the late evening and early morning hours reviewing designs and preparing for the post-show photographic session. However, when confronted with security footage from the hotel's internal cameras, her timeline proved to be substantially inaccurate. The footage revealed that Claire had in fact accessed Ashby's dressing room at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, a full 7 hours before she had claimed to have discovered his body. She had spent approximately 37 minutes in the room, a period that had clearly been omitted from her original account. When confronted with this evidence, she initially maintained her story, but eventually, under the sustained pressure of questioning, her composure began to fracture. "I wanted to help him," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the interview room. "Dr. Patterson had spoken to me about the conditions in the factories, about the people who had died because of inadequate safety measures. I work as Mr. Ashby's assistant, but I am not blind to the ethical implications of my position. David Carver had been attempting to convince me that Mr. Ashby had to be stopped, that no legal process would ever successfully constrain him, because he was too wealthy and too well connected." Inspector Craddock leaned Forward. Did you substitute the saline solution into Mr. Ashby's EpiPen, Miss Dubois? Claire shook her head vigorously. I didn't substitute it. I contacted David Carver and told him what I'd learned about Mr. Ashby's intentions to continue his business practices unchanged, despite Dr. Patterson's investigation. Carver was in a state of considerable distress, and I suggested to him that it seemed unlikely that anything short of Mr. Ashby's incapacity or death would prevent the continuation of the exploitation. I was attempting to suggest that perhaps some form of legal intervention might eventually become possible if Ashby's business operations were to be disrupted, but Carver interpreted my comments as encouragement to take more direct action. Inspector Craddock's expression suggested skepticism regarding this attempt to distance herself from the actual crime. However, I found the fabric softener and the contaminated EpiPen in Mr. Ashby's dressing room, she continued. I recognized what they were, and I understood immediately what they signified. Rather than reporting them, I concealed them in my personal bag. I was frightened, Inspector. I realized that my conversation with Carver might be interpreted as encouragement or facilitation of a crime. I wanted time to consider what the correct course of action might be. Miss Marple, who had been observing this exchange with characteristic attention, interjected a question. Miss Dubois, when you discovered the contaminated items, did you examine the EpiPen itself? Did you verify that it contained saline rather than epinephrine? Claire hesitated. No, I didn't. I saw the fabric softener, and I assumed that the substitution had been made. I panicked and removed the items without examining them thoroughly. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Inspector, I wonder whether we might conduct a more detailed examination of the EpiPen and the residue patterns on Mr. Ashby's clothing. The devil, as they say, resides in the details, and I suspect these details may provide more clarity regarding the actual sequence of events. Over the following 2 days, forensic examination revealed that the EpiPen had not actually been used at the time Claire discovered it. The plunger had been moved, suggesting that the medication had been removed by the syringe rather than being injected. This suggested that someone had extracted the epinephrine and replaced it with saline prior to the discovery, and that Ashby had used this substitute medication in a futile attempt to counteract his allergic reaction. More significantly, the fabric softener residue on the clothing bore traces of an additional substance, one that suggested deliberate enhancement of the allergenic properties through the introduction of a peanut oil derivative that would have been virtually undetectable to normal inspection, but would create a severe reaction in someone with Ashby's particular sensitivity. The deliberation and sophistication of the preparation suggested someone with considerable knowledge of chemistry and of Ashby's specific medical vulnerabilities. Chapter 7. The Weight of Responsibility. The breakthrough in the case came unexpectedly during a follow-up interview with Dr. James Patterson. The federal investigator appeared to have aged substantially in the days following Ashby's death, his weathered face bearing additional lines that suggested distress and inner conflict. When confronted with the evidence regarding the contaminated EpiPen and the chemical enhancement of the fabric softener, his facade of professional detachment crumbled entirely. I did it, he said quietly, his hands trembling as he set down his coffee cup. I prepared the contaminated clothing and the substituted EpiPen. David Carver approached me with the information about his conversations with Claire Dubois, and he made it clear that he was considering taking matters into his own hands. I recognized that Carver was emotionally unstable and that allowing him to act might result in a crude and unsuccessful attempt that would accomplish nothing except his own imprisonment. I made a conscious decision that if someone was to take action, it should be someone with the knowledge and sophistication to ensure success. I have spent my professional career attempting to work within systems designed to protect people like Marcus Ashby, systems that have proven ineffective and corrupt. When direct legal intervention became impossible due to Ashby's manipulation of my investigative authority, I arrived at the conclusion that extraordinary measures were justified. Inspector Craddock's expression remained neutral, though Miss Marple observed the tightening around his eyes that suggested the shock of such a confession. Dr. Patterson, you're admitting to the premeditated murder of Marcus Ashby? Patterson nodded heavily. Yes, I researched the means carefully, ensured that the substitution would be effective given his particular vulnerabilities, and arranged the execution with precision. I provided the contaminated clothing to David Carver, knowing that his employment at Ashworth Linens would provide him with access to Ashby's items. I assisted in the modification of the EpiPen, replacing the medication with saline and introducing markers that would make the peanut oil additive in the fabric softener considerably more potent. However, Patterson continued, there is something I must clarify regarding my motivations and the nature of the evidence regarding my actions. I did not act from simple desire for revenge or personal vendetta. I acted from the conviction that Marcus Ashby had become an instrument of systematic exploitation and death, and that his removal from positions of power would prevent the continuation of that exploitation and the deaths that it necessarily entailed. Inspector Craddock rose from his chair, moving toward Patterson with the intent of placing him under arrest. However, Miss Marple raised her hand gently, requesting a moment of additional conversation before such formal measures were undertaken. "Dr. Patterson," she said carefully, "I believe your account is substantially accurate regarding the nature of the plot against Marcus Ashby. However, I wonder whether you might clarify one particular detail. You suggested that you provided the contaminated clothing to David Carver, with the expectation that his employment at Ashworth Linens would facilitate the substitution into Ashby's legitimate laundry. However, Mr. Carver's employment at that facility ended 3 days before the fashion show, suggesting that he would not have had access to the final processing of Mr. Ashby's items. How would you account for this discrepancy?" Patterson's expression shifted, revealing surprise that Miss Marple had identified this inconsistency in his confession. After a moment of hesitation, he responded with evident reluctance. The clothing was actually substituted by someone else. Someone who had access to Ashby's items in the final hours before his death at the hotel itself. I had not anticipated that this person would become involved, and when they did, I found myself in the position of being complicit in an action I had not explicitly planned or approved. Inspector Craddock resumed his seat, recognizing that Miss Marple's line of questioning had revealed complexity beyond Patterson's initial confession. "Who was this person?" he demanded. Patterson's jaw tightened visibly. "I cannot reveal their identity without being absolutely certain that doing so would not constitute an act of betrayal towards someone motivated by genuine ethical concerns, even if the expression of those concerns took forms that I might not have anticipated or approved." Chapter 8. The Weight of Complicity. The statement from Dr. Patterson, though seemingly incomplete, had provided sufficient information for Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple to identify the individual who had physically implemented the final substitution of Ashby's contaminated items. Forensic examination of hotel security footage, combined with staff interviews, revealed that Richard Kellerman, the hotel's event coordinator, had access to Ashby's dressing room at approximately 9:30 on the morning of the designer's death, a visit that was ostensibly conducted to discuss final arrangements for post-show publicity. When confronted with this evidence, Kellerman initially protested his innocence, claiming that his visit had been purely professional and had involved no interference with Ashby's personal belongings. However, when presented with photographic evidence showing him handling items that matched the description of Ashby's contaminated clothing, his resistance began to crumble. Under sustained questioning, Kellerman revealed that he had been contacted by Dr. Patterson approximately 1 week before the fashion show. Patterson had provided him with a detailed briefing regarding the nature of Ashby's business practices and the suffering that had resulted from those practices. Patterson had also provided him with instructions regarding the placement of the contaminated items and the substituted EpiPen, along with assurance that the action, while technically illegal, was morally justified and necessary to prevent the continuation of serious crimes. "I was hesitant at first," Kellerman explained, his voice carrying the weight of profound regret and conflict. But Dr. Patterson was persuasive. He provided me with documentation regarding the specific deaths that had resulted from inadequate safety measures in Ashby's factories. He explained that all legal remedies had been exhausted, and that no criminal justice system would successfully prosecute someone with Ashby's resources. He convinced me that allowing Ashby to continue operating was equivalent to being complicit in future deaths that might be prevented through his incapacitation or removal. Inspector Craddock's frustration was evident. "Mr. Kellerman, Did you replace Mr. Ashby's EpiPen with saline solution? Kellerman nodded slowly. I did. Dr. Patterson provided me with the substituted device and detailed instructions regarding how to effect the exchange without leaving obvious evidence. I told myself that I was simply following instructions, that I was not truly responsible for the consequences of those instructions. However, I recognize now how foolish that rationalization was. I am fully complicit in Marcus Ashby's death. As both Patterson and Kellerman provided detailed statements regarding their roles in the conspiracy, a picture emerged of a coordinated action involving multiple individuals, each contributing according to their particular capabilities and access. Patterson had served as the planner and the source of the moral justification. Carver had provided information and moral support. Claire Dubois had inadvertently served as the means of communication between the conspirators, and Kellerman had executed the final act of substitution that made Ashby's death inevitable. Miss Marple observed these proceedings with a sense of profound sadness, recognizing in this conspiracy an illustration of how the pursuit of justice, when constrained or thwarted by institutional corruption, might drive otherwise ethical individuals toward the commission of serious crimes. The men involved were not monsters or professional criminals. They were people who had become convinced that institutional systems designed to prevent exploitation had failed so completely that extraordinary measures were justified. Yet the tragedy extended beyond the question of moral justification or philosophical debates regarding the extent to which the ends might justify the means. The reality was that Marcus Ashby was dead, his death the result of a calculated and premeditated conspiracy. The individuals involved would face serious legal consequences, and the systemic issues that had motivated their actions would likely continue despite the removal of one particular perpetrator. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The trial of Dr. James Patterson, Richard Kellerman, and David Carver occupied the attention of the criminal justice system for several months following their arrest and formal charges. Claire Dubois, whose role had been determined to be one of inadvertent facilitation rather than deliberate participation, had charges against her substantially reduced, and was eventually released after accepting a plea agreement requiring community service and mental health counseling. The prosecution's case was straightforward, relying on the detailed confessions provided by the defendants and the forensic evidence that corroborated their accounts of the events. The defense, however, proved more complex, attempting to argue that the defendants' actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by genuine moral concerns and represented a form of justified response to institutional failure and corruption. Miss Marple attended the trial proceedings, observing from the public gallery as the case unfolded before the judge and jury. She noted with particular interest the testimony of various labour advocates, factory workers, and those individuals who had suffered loss through Ashby's business practices. The testimony painted a detailed picture of systematic exploitation and suffering that had been deliberately concealed and ignored by those in positions of authority and responsibility. The prosecution successfully argued that the defendants' actions, regardless of their motivations, represented the commission of murder, and that permitting moral justification to override legal responsibility would undermine the rule of law and permit any individual to appoint themselves judge and executioner of those they deemed to be wrongdoers. The defense argued that the rule of law had already been undermined by institutional corruption, and that truly exceptional circumstances might justify exceptional responses. The jury's verdict was guilty on all counts of murder for Dr. Patterson and Richard Kellerman, guilty on charges related to conspiracy and facilitation for David Carver. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, acknowledged the complexity of the moral issues involved, while maintaining that the defendants had no legal authority to take matters into their own hands, regardless of the failures of institutional systems. Dr. Patterson received a sentence of 25 years imprisonment. Richard Kellerman received a sentence of 20 years. David Carver, whose role had been one of provision of information and moral encouragement, rather than direct implementation, received a sentence of 15 years. All three maintained steadfast dignity throughout the proceeding, expressing no remorse for their actions despite accepting legal responsibility for their consequences. Chapter 10. The Morning After Justice. Several weeks after the conclusion of the trial, Miss Marple found herself seated in her preferred chair in the library of the Ashworth Hotel, where Patricia Summers had invited her to attend a gathering organised to discuss the future of the Ashby fashion house and its responsibilities regarding the workers who had been exploited by the designer's business practices. The meeting was attended by various representatives of labour advocacy organisations, workers themselves, legal representatives, and business leaders who had begun to recognise that the issues highlighted by the Ashby case extended far beyond a single designer or design house. The discussion centred on the implementation of supply chain transparency, fair labour standards, and mechanisms for ensuring that workers in manufacturing facilities received adequate compensation and worked in safe conditions. Patricia Summers had become unexpectedly passionate about these issues following the conclusion of the trial, and had committed substantial resources toward the establishment of an independent monitoring organisation designed to ensure compliance with fair labour standards across the fashion industry. Miss Marple found this development gratifying, recognising that sometimes the consequences of tragedy might include the catalyst for broader social change and reform. As the meeting concluded and attendees began to depart, Patricia approached Miss Marple with evident interest in her perspective. "Jane, do you believe that justice has been properly served in this matter?" She asked the question with the uncertainty of someone who has been confronted with moral complexity and found that simple answers prove inadequate. Miss Marple removed her glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully, a habit she employed when considering how best to respond to questions that resisted easy resolution. "I believe," she said carefully, "that justice represents something considerably more complex than the simple punishment of individual wrongdoers. Marcus Ashby is dead, that is certainly true, and Dr. Patterson and his associates face substantial legal consequences for their actions. Yet the systematic conditions that permitted and indeed facilitated the exploitation that motivated their actions remain substantially in place. Different designers will operate different factories, and unless we address the broader structural issues that incentivize the exploitation of workers, the tragedy will be repeated with different participants in different locations." That said, she continued, "I recognize that Dr. Patterson's actions, while technically criminal, emerged from genuine moral conviction and from the exhaustion of legitimate institutional remedies. He did not act from malice or personal revenge, but from the conviction that serious crimes were being committed and that no legitimate mechanism existed to address those crimes. That recognition does not absolve him of legal responsibility, but it does suggest that the broader society bears some responsibility for the conditions that led him to such conclusions." Patricia nodded slowly, absorbing the implications of Miss Marple's words. "Then you believe the trial was unjust? That the verdicts were incorrect?" "Not at all," Miss Marple replied gently. "I believe that the verdicts were proper and that the sentences were appropriate given the seriousness of the crimes committed. The rule of law requires that individuals not appoint themselves as judges and executioners, regardless of the justness of their moral convictions. However, I also believe that the existence of such convictions and the desperation that led reasonable people to commit serious crimes in the name of pursuing justice should provoke considerable reflection regarding institutional reform and the adequacy of existing mechanisms for addressing serious wrongdoing in business and industry." As Miss Marple prepared to depart from the hotel, she paused to observe the view from the library windows, looking out over the city that continued with its daily routines, largely unaware of or unaffected by the drama that had unfolded during the previous weeks. The fashion industry would continue, designers would create beautiful garments, and vast populations of workers would continue to labour in conditions that most citizens remained largely unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge. Yet the Ashby case had revealed something important regarding the potential for change and the possibility that systematic attention to ethical concerns might gradually reshape business practices and institutional responses. Whether such change would prove sufficient to prevent future tragedies of the sort that had motivated Dr. Patterson's actions remained an open question, one that would require sustained attention and effort from people of goodwill and moral conviction. Miss Marple reflected, as she had so often reflected during her long life, that human nature remained fundamentally complex and resistant to simple moral categories or easy judgments. The individuals involved in the Ashby case were neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but people confronted with circumstances that placed them in positions of profound moral complexity, circumstances in which no choice available to them could be said to be entirely free of ethical compromise or consequence. As she made her way home through the evening streets, she considered that perhaps this recognition of complexity, this refusal to accept simple judgments regarding the moral worth of human beings or the appropriate responses to systemic injustice, represented the most important element of genuine wisdom and genuine justice. The law might provide guidance and constraints regarding acceptable behavior, but the cultivation of moral judgment required something considerably more nuanced and difficult than any legal code could provide.